Over the weekend, politicians in both parties released statements in response to Hamas's attack on Israel. And in my opinion, almost all of them missed the mark, with a few exceptions. And we're going to talk about that because I think that what U.S. politicians say is important given how much influence America has in that region. But having said that, though, I do want to first are subject to change, and it's very difficult to track these kinds of things as it happens. But just know it's a very uncomfortable, nauseating thought, but that is the reality. So we're not going to focus too much on specific numbers. Have been escalating all year in the lead up to this outbreak of violence. As the Washington Post explains, as of September 19th, before Saturday's outbreak of violence, 227 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli troops or settlers this year, according to UN figures, with most of those deaths, 189, occurring in the West Bank. At least 29 Israelis, mostly in the West Bank, were also killed this year as of the end of August. Even a bit further, the violence from this year also has not occurred in a vacuum. More and more Palestinians are forcibly evicted from their homes and displaced. They're segregated and they have no civil rights, no civil liberties. And in Gaza, the situation is even worse. As Common Dreams explains, Israel has been imposing a land, air, and sea blockade on the Gaza Strip for nearly 2 decades, impoverishing much of the crowded enclave's population and denying millions sufficient access to clean water and other necessities. Children, who make up roughly half of Gaza's population, have been disproportionately affected. So we're talking about a very young population in a densely populated area that is now being bombed again. And already before this current outbreak of violence, people in Gaza had no economic prospects. Unemployment was above 40%. They're effectively living in the world's largest open-air prison where no one can leave or enter without Israel's permission. And this was already a humanitarian disaster, but that problem is going to be exacerbated because of this current wave of bombing. I mean, more than half of Gazans already needed aid. 3% didn't have access to potable water. And now that's going to get worse. But if you are a Gazan, resisting this blockade is literally a matter of life and death. But the problem is that there's just no good options for resisting. Because when they resist using violence, obviously, Israel responds predictably with even more violence. But when they resist peacefully and they protest, they're still brutalized. In fact, you can't even peacefully resist here in the United States because the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is banned in dozens of U.S. states. So we're not even allowed to advocate for peaceful resistance here in many states. So we're in this horrible situation, and it looks like there's no end. There's a power imbalance here, and only one side can choose to end apartheid, choose to end all the suffering. And that is Israel. And as long as Israel chooses to maintain this brutal system of oppression and subjugation and apartheid, peace is never going to be possible. And this is what politicians have to acknowledge. You can't just look at what happened in a vacuum. You have to zoom out and look at the entire set of circumstances here and understand that this sort of hitting civilians is a war crime. It's never okay. It's bad regardless of who does it. And I hope that people condemn the slaughter of innocent civilians because that is not okay. And it's really important to remember as we see these news stories here that we shouldn't conflate the actions of Hamas with the actions of all Palestinians. And in the same breath, we shouldn't conflate the actions of the far-right Israeli government with the actions of Israel's citizens. And I say this because my country, the United States, has done horrible things. It is a colonizer country. We invaded Iraq when I was just a young man, couldn't vote yet. And I think probably many, if not most, Americans supported that. But I didn't. But we were lied to. There was a lot of propaganda. So I think that even though in a democratic situation you can elect your government, you still, in the end, don't have total control of what your government does. And in the same way that I wouldn't want to be blamed for the actions of my government, for the atrocities of my government, even if I am indirectly responsible because my tax dollars fund it. I wouldn't want people to view Palestinians as responsible for the actions of Hamas in the same way I wouldn't want people to view Israelis responsible for the actions of their government. When it comes to war, we've got to remember that people are people and human life is precious. And that's one thing that I want people to understand. Now, I've seen people compare this to 9/11 and say that this is Israel's 9/11. But if they think that that is indeed the case, then there's a lesson that they should learn. Because on 9/11, 3,000 Americans tragically died, but over 1 million people in the Middle East that had nothing to do with that perished in response. And with the way that things are going, it seems like Israel is gearing up for a similar response, which is horrifying. So they're cutting off electricity, food, water, and gas to people he deems as animals. Now ask yourself this question. Do you think that he's referring exclusively to Hamas here? Because even if he is, the fact that he's telling you that all 2 million plus people in Gaza are going to lose power and water, that tells you everything you need to know about this power dynamic. The situation is untenable. I mean, imagine if a government that you couldn't vote for controlled your access to who agrees more with Tlaib, the left in Israel, because Ofer Kassif, a member of the Knesset's leftist Hadash coalition, echoed the same points made by Tlaib.